Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim Daf Nun Vav. Today's daf is sponsored by Judy and Gerald Shapiro for the marriage of their son, Oren Shapiro, to Faye Gamliel of Toronto. Mazel Tov, and may they build a bayit ne'eman b'Yisrael, and a bayit filled with love and peace. Today's daf is sponsored by Beth Kisalaf in loving memory of the 11 precious souls killed on the 18th of Cheshvan at Dor Chadash, New Light, and Tree of Life in Pittsburgh. Joyce Feinberg, Dr. Richard Gottfried, Rose Mallinger, Dr. Jerry Rabinowitz, Cecil Rosenthal, David Rosenthal, Bernice Simon, Sylvan Simon, Daniel Stein, Melvin Wax, and Irvin Younger. And in honor of the Daf Yomi Pittsburgh group under the leadership of Rabbi Amy Bardak and Eric Leachy. Yizacham Baruch. Okay, we're going to get started today with the very bottom of Nun Ham Mubet. We're going to start with the statement of Rav Yehuda in the name of Shmuel, then we're going to see a very similar statement in a Braita, and then we're going to try to figure something out, which is going to take a little bit of time. So, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, what we talked about yesterday was what is considered the Azara. What are the boundaries of the Azara for the purposes of slaughtering kodshim kalim? Right? You can slaughter kodshim kalim in all of the Azara. So what are the boundaries of the Azara? So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, and he gives us the numbers. How many cubits by how many cubits is the Azara? He says, Ein chayavim mishum tumah. Now he mentions another issue that's important for purposes of defining what are the borders of the Azara. You can't come into the Azara if you're impure, right? Again, the Azara is what we call the temple courtyard. It's an open space within which you have the Heichal and the kodashim, which is a closed space. It's basically this open courtyard. And he says you're not allowed to go in if you're impure into the Azara. We've learned that before. But you're chayav. Now, what are you chayav? You're chayav karet. So, ein chayavim mishum tumah ela al orech 187 al rocha 135. You're only chayav on biat mikdash, coming into the temple impure, in this space that's 187 length by a width of 135. Okay, that is where you cannot come into the Azara at all. Okay, if you're impure, that's your space. Okay, that's what Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel. Now, skip a little later. Tane kamed Rav Nachman. In other words, later in generation, we get to Rav Nachman. Tane kamed Rav Nachman, he's third generation. Okay, Rav Yehuda, second generation. I mean, the truth is they overlap somewhat. It's also sort of second to third. So Atana brings a Braita in front of Rav Nachman. Kol ha'azara hayta kuf pezayin al rochav kuf lamed hey, which is 187 by 135, says the same thing. Here we have someone who brings this from a Braita. Okay, so they say there's a Braita that says this. Okay. When the student brought this in front of Rav Nachman said to him, Amalei hachi amali abba. Nachman's father was Rav Yaakov. He was known in his own right to be a scholar. Wasn't as big a scholar as Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman's very, very well known as a scholar and a judge. His father was what we call a sofer, one of the sofrei dayanim, okay, of Shmuel. Anyway, he says to the student, my father told me, kigon zeh, this space that you mentioned. Okay, so let's just to be clear. Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel specifically, this is the Azara for the purposes of coming in impurity, right? You're chayav if you come in with impurity on your body or something, right? If you walk into the Azara, impure. The Braita just defined what are the borders of the Azara. Didn't say anything about the ramifications of this. So he says, my father said to me, kigon zeh, like this, kohanim nechnesim l'sham ve'ochlim sham kodshim. The kohanim go in there and eat their kodshim in that space. V'shochatim sham kodshim kalim, and they slaughter kodshim kalim. And chayavim mishum tumah, and they're liable for impurity. So his father points out, which, for us, we'd say, oh, that's a big chiddush, or I don't know, maybe not a chiddush, but he's organizing things for us. Then why is it important to demarcate the borders of the Azara? Because you need to know, where are you allowed to eat kodshim if you're only kohanim eat kodshim? Where can the kohanim eat kodshim? Only within that boundary of the 187 by 135. And that's where you slaughter kodshim kalim. And that's where you become obligated karet for tumah. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Lemiute mai. Okay. He doesn't need to tell us basic halachot. Okay, we know this. This is something everybody knows, that the Azara is, why do we need to define what the Azara is? Exactly for these purposes. Kodshim kalim, right? We know already from our Mishna about kodshim kalim. We know about tumah b'mikdash. We know about eating kodshim. We know all this. Like, what's he telling us? Okay, in other words, let's put it this way. The Azara is the place where you eat kodshim, you slaughter kodshim kalim, and you're liable for karet if you walk in impure. And if you know the borders of the Azara are 187 by 135, then you know that. You can put 1 and 2 together, and you get 1 and 1 together, and you get 2. Right? We don't need someone to tell you 1 plus 1 is 2. So his father must have been trying to tell us something more. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen now, and I'm going to show you. Okay, so today we have a study guide, and through the study guide, we're going to go through the daf and see the structure here, because it's a little bit confusing, so I wanted to organize it for you. So now we have this statement, and the question is, what was the purpose of what either Rav Nachman was telling everyone or what his father said, really? Okay, why did his father say this, and why did Rav Nachman tell this to everyone? What was he trying to say? Lemi'ute mai. What does it mean, lemi'ute? It means that if he's saying these are the boundaries, then it means there's some area where you can't eat kodshim, you can't slaughter kodshim kalim, and you're not obligated karet mishum tuma. So what is this area that he was trying to say that's not within the 187 by 135? So we're going to have 2 possibilities, and at this stage of the Gemara, both seem to be problematic. So if you want to say that he's coming to exclude windows, now windows in those days, you have to remember, were not with glass. They were just open windows. So theoretically, you could sit on the window sill and eat if you wanted, like an open space, or doors, or the thickness of the wall. Okay, so if you're in the airspace, you're in the space of the wall area, right, in between, let's say, the doorposts, and you wanted to eat, so maybe it's trying to tell you you're not allowed to eat there. The boundaries are within, inside the chalon, like those are out, okay? But that's not true, because Tanina, it says in a Tanaitic source, ha-chalonot va'ovi ha-choma kilifnim. It says that the thickness of the walls, the windows, all that is considered in the kodshim. And we're trying to say, he's saying this boundary to exclude something. It can't be that. Okay. Now, there were these chambers. There were rooms on the sides, closed rooms, right? We talked about how the courtyard was open. Within that, there was the closed area of, as we said, the heichal, which included, right, the heichal and the kodashim. But we also, and the ulam also, the entrance area to there was covered. I believe it was covered, if I'm not making a mistake right now. But the question really is, there were these rooms on the side, okay? So there were rooms on the sides of the courtyard. These rooms were unique in that they were half in the chol and half in the kodesh. They were basically half the room was in the space that's considered technically within those boundaries of the Azara, and half the room is out. Okay, so if you look at the walls, okay, if you have those maps from the Machon Mikdash that I mentioned, so those maps show these rooms, and you can see they're half out, half in. Okay, they're like if the wall goes, to the whatever, there's an opening in the wall, there's a room, and it goes, and they were closed rooms. So if we're talking about those lishakot, now, obviously, you don't need to exclude, okay, there's 2 different types of these chambers. Some opened inside and some opened outside. So if they were half-half, but open to the outside, for sure they're not part of the Azara, because they don't even open into the Azara. No one would have even thought so. So what they're suggesting is maybe he's coming to exclude those chambers that were b'niyot b'chol u'ptuchot lakodesh. They were built. Now, when it says b'niyot b'chol, it means part of it is in the chol, part of it is in the part that's out of the Azara, part of it is in the space that's within the wall, within the space of the Azara, and they're open into the Azara. So maybe what he's saying is that space is not considered kodshim. Okay, the kol Azara was 187 by 135. Those chambers, part of them are outside that boundary. And even though they open into the Kodesh, they're not Kodesh. But that also doesn't fit with the Tanaitic source, because Vahatnan, there's a Mishna that says, Tochan Kodesh. Those actually are Kodesh. So now we're stuck. Because it can't mean to exclude the chalonot and the dilatot and the oviachoma, right? The windows and the doors and the thickness of the walls. And it can't come to exclude the chambers, so what is it coming to exclude? So the Gemara answers that it is coming to exclude the chambers, and that source that said Tochan Kodesh, mid'Rabbanan. That source that said Tochan Kodesh is actually saying they're Kodesh on a d'Rabbanan level. In other words, those chambers are not really part of the Kodesh. So they're not, you can't eat kodshim, you can't slaughter kodshim kalim, and you're not chayav mishum tuma karet, but you shouldn't go in there if you're tameh, because on the Rabbanan level, we're going to treat them, since they open into the kodesh, we're going to treat them like kodesh. And that, we resolve our problem. The problem is that we're going to have two other sources that seem to indicate that actually is those lishakot, those chambers, are actually deoraita kodesh. Okay? And for this, we're going to have a difficulty, then the answer, then difficulty, answer, okay? So it's going to be a little bit long-winded. And I put a chart here to also help summarize it, so you don't lose track of what's going on. So the main thing we're going to do in this section is say, are you really sure that, in other words, if they're deoraita, then what's the issue? The problem is, and the number one, we resolve, so again, we had a Mishna that said the tochan is kodesh, the chambers are kodesh. If they open into the kodesh, we treat them like kodesh, which we said was only rabbinic. And that was to resolve our problem of what was the father of Rav Nachman telling us by saying the Azara is just 187 by 135. It was to tell us, but it doesn't include those chambers, which part of them is outside that space. Okay? It doesn't include the chambers. So we have the chambers, according to everything we've explained right now, the chambers are not considered kodesh, right? They're not considered part of the Azara on a Torah level. On a rabbinic level, we should be strict, but on a Torah level, they're not. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute, how could you say deoraita lo? Vahatanya, there's another braita, so we're going to bring two more braitas that seem to contradict this. And they're going to basically seem to be saying, okay, the first one you can see from the chart is only talking about eating there, okay, because there's three issues. Eating, slaughtering, right, eating kodshim, slaughtering kodshim kalim, the lower level sanctity, and, because remember, kodshim have to be only in the north, and we're talking about the whole space. And are you chayav karet mishum tuma? Okay, so the first braita only relates to eating. So it says here in this braita, l'shakot pniyot b'chol uptuchot lakodesh minayin shchanim nichnasim l'sham v'ochlim sham kodshai kodashim v'shayrei mincha. So again, we're talking about these chambers that are built in the half kodesh, half chol, and they open into the Azara. How do we know that kohanim are allowed to go in there and eat their kodshim and the shayrei mincha, the remainders of the mincha, which are also kodshim? So how do we know this? Talmud lomar b'chatzar ol moed yochluha. What they're basically going to say here is there's a drasha, and I'll show you the drasha in a minute because it's not so clear how they get it from here. But there's some extra phrase. The whole phrase is actually extra here. And it says in the courtyard of all moed they can eat it. Because it's extra, okay, I'll already tell you before I continue my sentence why it's extra. So I'm going to read you the Pasuk Vayikra chapter 6, verse 9. V'hanoteret mimena, this is the mincha offering. Whatever's left of the mincha, yochlu Aharonu banav, the kohanim, right? Aaron and his sons will eat it. Matzot teachel b'makom kadosh. Okay, so they're matzot, they're not chametz. They will eat them b'makom kadosh. They will eat them in a sanctified place. Okay, once they say they're going to eat them in a sanctified place, then you don't need the pasuk to say b'chatzar ol moed yochlua. We know what's the sanctified place, the courtyard of ol moed, which is the Azara. So why does it say an extra phrase there to teach you there's somewhere the Torah is adding chatzerot harbei etz l'achila achat. Okay, it's a very weird way of saying it, but what it means is there's extra space that you can eat the kodshim. So basically, what we're going to say very simply, there's this drasha that teaches you can eat kodshim in the lishakot that are open to the chol. So how can you say they're not the Azara, right? How can we say that on a Torah level they're not the Azara? We're allowed to eat the kodshim there, then obviously they're part of the Azara. To which Amarava la'achila shani. You're going to say, no. They're really not technically part of the Azara. But because there's a drasha, they're included as well. Okay? So technically speaking, meaning for the purposes of shchita, and for the purposes of a tamid person that walks into the temple, you're not going to get karet. You're not going to be able to slaughter them there. But there's a unique halacha by eating. Okay? So we're back to our original answer, which is on a Torah level, these are not part of the Azara, okay? And if you look at the chart, right, the chart only related to eating. And then the answer is, yeah, eating is unique. Why is eating unique? Because of that drasha we saw in the Pasuk. B'chatzar ol moed yochlua, there's a special drasha that you can even eat in a place that technically isn't called the Azara for other purposes. And that's these chambers. And that's unique. Okay, so we're done. We put that aside, we're good. But now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute. Aval inyan tumalo? Wait. You're saying this is just achila, okay? which means that the lishka is not right. It's not kodesh for the purposes of impurity, right? You go in impure to that chamber, even though it opens into the kodesh, right? Everything we said until now, you're not chayav karet. But look at the source. V'hatanya Braita 2. Lishakot b'niot lachol uptuchot lakodesh. Kohanim nichnasim l'sham v'ochlim sham kodshai kodashim. Okay, so that so far fits with our last Braita. You can eat kodshai kodshim there. You could say unique exception for food. Next line works also. Ein shochatim sham kodshim kalim. We don't slaughter kodshim kalim. Okay, that works perfectly, right? It's not the Azara. You can't slaughter. But look what the next phrase says. V'chayavim mishum tuma. Okay, so in the chart, right, we have ochlim, yes, because we have a unique exception. Shochatim, no, because it's not the kodesh, right? Not the kli Azara. But chayavim mishum tuma. Now you see here it says ken and it's crossed off, and then lo, because right now it says ken. In a minute we're going to change it and say, oh, there's a mistake in the Braita. Change the words, okay? But right now we're at the problem. It says chayavim mishum tuma. Now if you're chayav mishum tuma, what they mean is you get karet. You're not going to get karet if midorabanan. We don't call if midoraita from a Torah level. We don't call this the Azara. To which the Gemara answers, oh, there's obviously a mistake here. Because lav amart ein shochatin, didn't it say you can't slaughter? Those two things go hand in hand. If you can't slaughter, it's not the Azara, which means you wouldn't be chayav mishum tuma. So t'nei nami ein chayavim. We're going to assume those two things always go hand in hand. So if you say you don't slaughter, it means you're not chayav if you're tameh. So we've resolved it by changing the wording of the Braita. Well, we're going to end with that that's the answer, but we're going to raise a little question on that first and say, wait a minute. Let's try to think about this. Maybe there's a reason to say why you can't slaughter, but yet you'd still be chayav. Because bishlama ein shochatim, we understand why you would say in that chamber you can't slaughter, and that goes back to what we saw in yesterday's daf. Be'ina keneged hapetach v'leika. What do you need? You need petach ol moed to be able to slaughter, right? You need to see the ol moed. Now, if you're in a closed room, you can't see the ol moed. So that would explain why you can't slaughter. But ela ein chayavin amai. But, right, it could, what they're basically saying is, look, it says you can eat there. It says you can't slaughter, and it says you are chayav. So if you take those two, eating and tuma, right, now eating you could potentially explain, but it does sound like this is the Azara. There's just a technical problem with shchita that you can't see the opening of Ol Moed because you're in a closed room. Okay? So shouldn't that basically say that this is a bad edit, right? Because maybe that's really what it means. And then we're in trouble. Because if it really means this is the Azara, then we're back to square one with Rav Nachman's father. What was he trying to say? So, and what Rava answered, which is, oh yeah, it's only Kodesh on a rabbinic level. Okay, so we have problems with that and problem with that. To which the Gemara answers and says, and with this we'll finish this section. Well, we have one more thing to deal with, but we'll finish this back and forth. Now they don't like this whole thing. The ein shochatin is because you can't see the petach, because they say the following. According to what you're suggesting, the ein shochatin is because you can't see the petach. Ein shochatin milo askina di kashchita keneged petach. It must be that they're talking about a case when they say the lishakora b'niot l'chol uptuchot l'kodesh, right? So you have this room that opens up into the Azara. You can't slaughter there. Now, what do you think? Which case do you think they're talking about? Where you could see the Ol Moed or you couldn't see the, right? Where you could see the Heichal or you can't see the Heichal. So they say, because let's just think about the room. If the room opens to the Azara, and remember, like some of them, let's say, are past the Heichal. But if you remember, we talked yesterday about the pishpishin, right? Where you could see in to the ulam there, which is basically like seeing into the eichal. They open these little doorways. So theoretically, if you open the door to the lishka, to the chamber, and the pishpishim are open, you could actually see in. So they say here, when it says ein shochatim, they wouldn't need to tell you in a case where it's closed, that's the ileka. If it wasn't open, then why do you need to tell us ein shochatim? Of course ein shochatim for the reason that everybody knows. If you can't see Ol Moed, you're not allowed to slaughter. Right? If the door is closed, of course you can't slaughter. So it must be that the door's open and you could see. And still it says ein shochatim, which means you can't say the reason for ein shochatim is because you need to be able to see the entrance. And then how do we explain ein chayavin? And then we should be back to saying really chayavin. The whole thing really is the koret. No. What it's trying to say is Even if you can see the petach ol moed, still Tani ein shochatim. Why? Mishum de lo kaddish. And therefore Tani nami ein chayavin. So the only way to explain the ein shochatim is because it's not sanctified, that space. The chambers are not sanctified. It's sanctified of the Azara, of the courtyard. And therefore, ein shochatim, and therefore the edit is an obvious edit of ein chayavin. Again, this is based on that there be no reason to tell us ein shochatim if you can't see the ol moed, because that we know from somewhere else. So why would this Braita tell us this? This Braita is telling us if you're in this chamber and you can see ol moed, and you can't see the heichal, you still can't slaughter the kodshim because this is not a sanctified area, and therefore you're not chayav karet for going into the temple. So that resolves everything, because now what do we say? Okay, and for this I did the chart of the two Braitot. We basically say, okay, if you start with, okay, I didn't put this on the chart, but the Mishna that says Tochan is Kodesh, the area of the Lishakot is actually Kodesh, that's only rabbinic. It's not really Kodesh. But it says you can eat there. That's a special, unique halacha by eating, which actually fits with the second Braita as well, that says you can eat there. And then slaughtering, in the first Braita it didn't relate to slaughtering or tumah, so we're fine. In the second Braita, it basically says no to both, and that's because we had to edit it and say you're not chayav mishum tumah, just like you can slaughter. Okay, and with that we finish that discussion. But we have one other thing to sort, which is, now we have a question on the fact that we can eat kodshim there in those chambers. Okay, so now they say, which seems to imply you can eat in the chambers even if you don't see the petach, right? Even if it's not open and you can't see the heichal. So they say, la'achila lo be'inan keneged petach, and we have two sources. One is a Braita and one is a pasuk. So I wrote it up here like this is two parts of a difficulty and a resolution to each. And also at the bottom here, I put it in a chart form, okay? So we're going to talk about this right now. So the first difficulty is, what do you mean you don't need a petach for eating the kodshim? V'hatanya, Rabbi Yossi b'Rabbi Yehuda omer, shnei pishpashin, and we saw this, right? Shnei pishpashin ayu b'beit hachalifot. Now we didn't focus on these words, but now we're going to focus on them. Gofhad shmone, okay, they're 8 amot tall, the openings, right? Now it took us a little to figure out that we were talking about the openings there. Kedei lahachshir et Azara la'achilat kodshim. In order to, okay, ulishchita kodshim kalim. Yeah, we were focusing last time on the slaughtering of the kodshim kalim. But now they say this is also lachshir Azara for eating kodshim. You need it open to eat the kodshim. Now we seem to just say before, as long as you're in the lishka, it didn't say anything about you need to see the opening there of the heichal. So it seems like you don't. And yet this source says you do. So Amar Ravina, smei mikan lachila. Okay, just edit. Okay, second time we're editing today. Just take out that whole thing. Kedei lachshir tazara. Oh, you actually leave those words. Lachila kodshim. Get rid of those 3 words. And it's just l'shchita kodshim kalim. Okay. Second difficulty. V'haktiv b'shluat habasar petach ol moed v'sham techluoto. Okay, this is in the miluim. The miluim, again, were those days where they were consecrating the tabernacle for the first time. And they had special sacrifices they brought. And it says, cook the meat in the opening of ol moed, and that's where you should eat it. So it sounds like you need petach ol moed for eating it. To which they answer, kodshai sha'ah shani. Now these are kodshai sha'ah. These were unique korbanot that were brought at a particular time for a particular purpose, once in everyone's lifetime, once in the whole world, one time. It was a one-time thing. Because it was a one-time thing, it had its own unique halachot. But generally, you can't learn from there to all kodshim that they have to be eaten petach ol moed. And with that, we resolve. There's no issue of seeing the petach for achila. Okay, that's the end of our first sugya today. Now we're going to go on to another question, or another statement, okay, where Rav Yitzchak bar Avudimi is going to say, and we're on the second side of the study guide, minayin, or almost on the second side of our daf, minayin l'daf shenifsal b'shkiyat hachama. How do you know that blood is disqualified at shkia? What does this mean? It means if you have a korban, right, you slaughter the animal. On the day you slaughter the animal, you also have to sprinkle the blood. We've learned this. Today we're going to finally find the source for it. How do we know that if you have blood, that the animal was sacrificed, and you don't put the blood on the altar that day, when it comes sunset, disqualified? Okay, here they're not focusing so much on the sunset rather than, Tzedek Kochavim, when the stars come out. But we're basically saying sunset, which means the end of the day. At the end of the day, it's disqualified. You can't use it, let's say, the next day. How do we know this? Shenema, what they're going to do is they're going to quote a pasuk, and then they're going to start raising difficulties with this. 2 difficulties with, are you sure you get that from the pasuk? And I say, yes. And then I say, well, maybe the pasuk could be read like this. No, we really can't get it from the pasuk. So first we're going to read it without explaining exactly how they get it from the pasuk, and then at the end you'll see how exactly they get it from the pasuk. Shenemal, biyom hakrivo et zivcho yachel. Okay, this is pasuk, here. It's Vayikra Zayin, pasuk tet Zayin. Im neder unidava, if you make a vow, okay, zevach korbano, okay, you make a vow to bring a sacrifice. Biyom hakrivo et zivcho yeachel. On the day you sacrifice your zevach, zevach means sacrifice, but also means something that's slaughtered. So on the day you hakrivo, now what's hakrivo usually? Bring the blood. Okay, la'akriv we said is kabbalat adam, we're bringing the blood, right? So hakrivo, they mean the blood. On the day you bring the blood from your slaughtered animal, it should be eaten. Okay, so now they say the following. B'yom she'ata zoveach ata makriv. B'yom she'ata zoveach ata makriv. So they say, here's the drasha. On the day that you slaughter, because slaughter is mentioned in the pasuk, and so is hakriv, that's when you sacrifice, meaning that's when you bring the blood. On the day that you don't slaughter, meaning the next day, you can't bring the blood. To which the Gemara says, turning out on the bed, wait. Now, what's this pasuk really talking about? Okay, if you go back to the pasuk, okay, I have it on the sheet here. So if you do a neder nidava, on the day that you hakrivo et zivcho, which are the words we're darshaning, ye'achel, will be eaten that day. Umi mochorat, and also the next day, vanotar mimenu ye'achel. Whatever's left to the next day, you're also allowed to eat it, because we're talking about a shlamim. And hanotar mi basar zevach b'yom shlishi, but if you leave it over 3 days, right, to the 3rd day, ba'esh yisarif, it should be burned. So wouldn't you say this pasuk has nothing to do with when do you sprinkle the blood? What's the subject of the sentence? When you can eat the meat. So don't you think this is just saying, on the day that you slaughter the meat, it should be eaten? And by the way, I just want to point out something interesting. We normally say, okay, you can eat it for, and we're going to get to this a lot, we're going to deal with this head on today. You can eat a shlamim for the day, the night, and the day. Okay, today we're going to learn where we get that from. How do you know you can't eat it the next night? Okay, but you can eat it for 2 days and 1 night in between those 2 days. Now, normally it sounds like you could, right, you have all that time. But if you look at this pasuk carefully, it's really saying, B'yom hakrivo et zivcho yachel, eat it that day. Notice there's an et nachta in that pasuk, okay? That's why I brought it with the tamim. Et nachta means take a break after yachel, and then it says, umi mochorat, and also tomorrow, hanotar mimenu yachel, what's left you can eat. Notice, by the way, there's something strange in this pasuk. Notar is usually it's left beyond its time. This is calling notar to what's left the next day. So it actually sounds like it's saying, eat it today, and if you leave it till tomorrow, oh, okay, you can eat it also. In other words, it's not, okay, because if you didn't have that nachta there, you could read it like this, right? You can eat it today and tomorrow. But it's not the way it reads with the tamim. The tamim say, eat it today, and tomorrow what's left, which isn't ideal, but you can eat it anyway, and only when you leave it till the 3rd day do you have to burn it. So that's just interesting to note how the simple understanding of this seems to be actually really ideally eat it that 1st day, but you have also the next day as well. Okay, that's a side point, but interesting. So, but that's why also maybe they're saying you need it to teach you, ideally eat the 1st day, on the day you do the zevach, and if not, you can eat the next day. So they say, no. That's not what it's not the only thing it's coming to teach you, because if that's what it wanted to teach you, ne'makra, b'yom zivcho yachel. So it should have said, on the day you slaughter it, eat it. If the whole thing was eating, why mention the blood at all? Hikrivu lamali, akrivo lamali, shma mina b'yom she'ata zavech ata makriv, b'yom she'ata zavech ata makriv. So they're basically saying, you could have lived without the word hakrivo. The fact that it's here must mean it's coming to teach you something additional. To which the Gemara still questions. It says, v'dilma hachi kama rachmana. Maybe this is what the Torah is saying. Now, here's a unique interpretation. Okay, again, obviously this is not the case, and we know it's not the case. But what they're suggesting is, you could read the pasuk differently. How do you know that you're reading the pasuk right? And they're raising this suggestion that we all know isn't true, but anyway, that's what they do in the Gemara. I kariv dam ha'idna nit'acha basar ha'ino l'machar. V'i kariv dam l'machar nit'acha basar l'machar l'yom ha'ochara. Okay, now let's read this pasuk the way they're reading it. Maybe it means like this. If you did the blood today, in other words, biyom hakrivo, you're saying it's a big deal they added this hakrivo. It's all about the blood. So if it's all about the blood, maybe it's all about the blood. Maybe you read it like this. On the day that you bring the blood from what you slaughtered, you have to eat it, which could mean if you did the blood today on the day that you slaughtered it, we can eat blood today and tomorrow. But if you pushed off the blood till tomorrow, maybe you can eat blood, you can eat the meat that next day and the day after. So if everything started on Sunday and you slaughtered the animal, maybe it means you have two possibilities. You can do the blood that day and then you have 2 days including that day. Or, right, Sunday, Monday. Or if maybe you could slaughter the animal on Sunday, do the blood on Monday, and then you get 2 days, Monday and Tuesday. Maybe that's what it means, because if it's, again, obviously we know this in the case, you can't leave the blood overnight, but what they're saying is you can't prove from this pasuk, because you could say, the focus on this pasuk is b'yom hakrivo, on the day you bring the blood, etzivcho, from what you slaughtered, maybe from what you slaughtered yesterday. And then it's all about the day you did the blood, you get to eat. To which the Gemara says, kind of obviously, which is, well, I don't know obviously, but if the whole focus is on when you bring the blood, then it doesn't even have to mention the slaughtering. Why does it mention the slaughtering? Now we're going to finally conclude what we started with. Now we understand the drasha a little better, because you really didn't need both words, hakrivo and zivcho. The fact that it mentions both the blood and the slaughtering, it teaches you that the blood and slaughtering have to happen on the same day. And then from that day, then you learn also from whatever day that is, you get 1 day and the next day. Okay? That's the drasha. Now we're going to get to our next sugya, which is somewhat connected. Itmar. We're going to have 2 machlokot between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. I brought them both in the chart in one place because it's kind of all one and the same, and the reason is the same for both, but they're really 2 different halachot based on the same thing. HaMechashev le'or shlishi. Okay. What we have is strange about, and this is what this next sugya is going to talk about the eating of the meat of the shlamim versus the eating of the meat of the other sacrifices. Eating of the meat of other sacrifices, you have a day and a night, right? So the day you sacrifice and that night. The shlamim, you have a day, a night, and a day. Now it's always strange. Why don't you have the next night? Okay? And in fact, it's even more strange because what does the pasuk say? Right? Eat it the next day also. And whatever's left on the 3rd day, which means daytime, burn it. So this nighttime of this, in between the 2nd day and the 3rd day is kind of neither here nor there. On the one hand, you're not allowed to eat it. On the other hand, you don't burn it. So the first issue is a debate between Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan. What if you have a machshava, mechashev le'or shlishi? You have a thought that I'm going to eat the meat while I'm slaughtering, let's say. I'm going to eat the meat on that 3rd night, right? The night before the 3rd day, which is not really allowed. On the other hand, we don't burn it yet. So Chizkiah amar kasher. Rabbi Yochanan amar pasul. So Chizkiah says kasher. It's not pigul. Why is it not pigul? Dahalo intik l'streifa, because you don't yet have to burn it. Rabbi Yochanan amar pasul. Daha'it chalei ma'achila. Rabbi Yochanan says, but you can't eat it. So since you can't eat it, and you have a pigul machshava to eat something outside of its time, that's pigul. Okay, we're finally back to pigul. If you missed it, right? We haven't had it yet this chapter. So Chizkiah, so now they're going to say, Tanya, ha'ochel le'or shlishi. What if you actually forget about pigul? What if you actually eat it that night? So do you get karet? Is that notar? So again, Chizkiah says, patur. Chizkiah amar patur de lo intik l'sreifa. As long as you don't have to burn it yet, you're not going to get karet for it notar. Now you shouldn't eat it. It's not allowed to be eaten that night, but you're not going to get karet for it. Rabbi Yochanan amar chayav da'it chalei ma'achila. What do you mean? You can't eat it. So if you can't eat it, you get karet. What does it have to do with the burning? And now we're going to have a braita, Tanya Kavatei Rabbi Yochanan, that supports Rabbi Yochanan's reading. Kodshim nechalim liyom echad. Okay, first we're going to talk about nechalim liyom echad, then we're going to talk about the shnei yamim v'layla echad. So the first part isn't really relevant. But kodshim nechalim liyom echad, the ones that can be eaten in 1 day, michashvim b'damam mishetishkach chama. So if you have a machshevet pigul that you're going to sprinkle the blood after the sun sets, obviously that's pigul. Now the meat and the stuff that's supposed to be burned on the altar all has to be done by the morning. So when does that kick in? At the early stage of dawn. The ones that have 2 days and 1 night, now we're going to see Rabbi Yochanan, that as soon as the night kicks in, disqualified completely. Okay, so the first day, right, the blood goes back to the previous sugya. They're disqualified already at night as soon as the sun sets. The parts that burn on the altar have to be burned by the morning. And biv saran, here's the key line, when you get to the shkia of the second day. Okay, so that means you don't wait till morning for it to be a problem, right? If you have a pigol machshava that you're going to eat the meat on that night, it's already pigol. And that proves Rabbi Yochanan. Okay, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to get to the whole halacha here about, okay, I didn't bring this on the sheet, but we do have some of the psukim here. We're going to darshan a few psukim to figure out how do we know even that you can't eat it that night. Okay, it doesn't really say so in the pasuk. It says tomorrow. Now tomorrow could include the night after it, and all the more so you would think so, because if you say you can eat it tomorrow, maybe it does mean tomorrow day and night. Now, even though halachically the day follows, right, the night goes with the next day, but in the nechalim liyom echad, the ones that have to be eaten on that day get the night. The night goes after the day. So maybe also here you would think the night would go with after the day, and that's where this bright is going to go. You might have thought maybe you can't eat it 2 days, 2 nights. Okay, right? Day, night, day, night. Vidinu, and it would be logical, what we call a binyan av, a paradigm from a very similar situation. Zevachim nechalim liyom echad, uzvachim nechalim l'shnei yamim. We have 2 types. There's the 1 days and the 2 days. Right? If you ever got confused by this, it's very confusing, and this bright is making order out of it all. It would be intuitive to say, if you can eat it for 1 day, and you get the night with it, laila acharehen, if you have ones that can be eaten for 2 days, then laila acharehen, you get 2 days and the 2 nights with it. Talmud lamal, that's why we learn it from v'hanotar ad yom. Okay, what's bothering in this pasuk is this pasuk in Vayikra Yud Tevav. B'yom zivchachem yachel u'mimachoch. Okay, so you can eat it that day and the next day. V'hanotar ad yom hashlishi. Now it should have said hanotar on the second day. What's until the second day? So the way they read it is u'mimachorat v'hanotar ad yom. Okay, they read it as if it connects with the first part of the pasuk, and the next day until the day. Okay, you only get until daytime. But od yom hunecha ve'eno necha la'or shlishi, and it can't be eaten at night. Well, now they're going to say like this. If you say you can only eat it day, night, day, and it ends right then what would you think? When do you burn it? Already at night, if it's left. Yachol yisaref miyad. So you would think, and again, paradigm from Zevachim. Hanechalim liyom echad. V'dinu Zevachim nechalim liyom echad u'Zevachim nechalim l'shnei yamim. We have 2 categories. We'll assume they're the same. Ma Zevachim nechalim liyom echad. The ones that can be eaten in a day, 1 day, and that night. When do you burn them? The next morning already. Techaf lachilas refa. As soon as you can't eat it anymore, you burn it. So, as vachim and echalim l'shnei yamim, techaf lachilas refa. You could say the same thing. The ones that can be eaten for 2 days, day, night, day, should be burned as soon as you can't eat it anymore at night. Right? This is talking about the dichotomy between, on the one hand, you can't eat, right? What we've been discussing for, also Rabbi Yochanan and Bechizkiah. This issue that it's a little bit of a weird thing. There's this gray space in between, right, day 2 and morning of 3, right, this nighttime where it's like neither here nor there or here and there. So you might have thought maybe you burn it at night, Talmud lomar, but then the pasuk says, Bayom hashlishi ba'esh yisaref. Bayom hatasrafo v'iyah tasrafo b'layla. You only burn it at the day, you don't burn it at night. So that's why we have this gray space of the nighttime. Okay, and the Braita highlighted it very well and explained everything. Okay, now we get to our next Mishna. We're on our last category. We're going to finish Ezu Makoman tomorrow already. Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach, which are a threesome that often go together. But today's Mishnah, as you see from this chart, are going to chart out what's the same about them and what's different about them. Ha-Bechor, v'ha-Maaser, v'ha-Pesach, kodshim, kalim. So they're all kodshim, kalim. Remember, Bechor is the firstborn that goes to the Kohen. Kohen has to sacrifice it and only can eat it after he sacrifices, but it's eaten by the Kohen only. Maaser is your 10th animal you have to bring as a tithe to the temple. You have to sacrifice it, but you get to eat the meat. That's one of the differences we're going to see. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 issues. Slaughtering, the blood, and eating. But within eating, there's 4 categories, and you're going to see the differeces. Who gets to eat it? Where does it get to be eaten? How do you prepare the meat? And until what time? So, can you eat the meat? Until when? So, shchitatam b'chol makom b'Azara. Okay, that they're all the same about. Okay, you can slaughter it anywhere in the Azara. Daman ta'um matana achat. Okay, another thing that's the same. 1 placing of blood. That's why this is the last Mishnah, because it's got the least amount of matanot. U'bavad sheyitain keneged hayesod. As long as you put it in a place where there's a yesod, meaning don't do it on the southeast corner. but anywhere else is fine. And we're going to assume, and this is where the Gemara is going to start off, that you do it in the same way, which is zrika. You stand at the bottom, you have it in your bowl, and you throw it at the wall. Shina ba'achilatan. However, the laws are different when it comes to eating them. So first, who eats them? Habachor ne'echal kohanim, as I said, only the kohanim eat. Hamaser l'chol adam, everyone can eat it. Ne'echalim b'chol, okay, it doesn't say about Pesach, we're going to get there soon. Ne'echalim b'chol ha'ir, you can eat, okay, these are actually, it's the same for everyone, where you can eat it in all of Jerusalem. B'chol ma'achal, okay, we're on B'chor ma'asir now. You can eat it any way you want to prepare the meat, you can. Lishnei yamin v'layla chad, and you can eat them both for 2 days and 1 night. So B'chor and ma'asir are very similar, other than who can eat the meat. That's the only difference. But Pesach is different in almost all these things, other than where it can be eaten. HaPesach eino ne'echal ela b'layla. You have to eat it that night. Ve'eino ne'echal ela chatzot. Now you really have till the morning, but we're careful to do it on chatzot. This is why we're careful to eat the afikomen until chatzot to remember the korban Pesach. Ve'eino ne'echal ela leminuyav. Only if you were registered. We spent a lot of time in Masechet Pesachim on that. Ve'eino ne'echal ela tzli. And this is very famous, right? There used to be one of the 4 questions was about this. You only eat it roasted. Okay, we don't eat roasted anymore. We don't, in fact, many have a minhag not to eat roasted meat at all at the Seder night because of this. So we don't want people to think that we're eating the Korban Pesach, or, we're trying to make it as if our meat is the Korban Pesach. So anyway, it was only roasted. It's the only way you can eat it. That's explicit in the Torah. So now the Gemara wants to go into who's the Tana of our Mishnah, and particularly they're talking about the Zrikat Dam. The fact that you sprinkle the blood for all 3 of them, and this is going to go back to a sugya we saw in Daf Lamed Zayin. I'll refresh your memory. Mantana, who thinks that B'chor, Ma'aser, and Pesach are all b'zrika? Rav Chisda, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, he detanya. Rabbi Yossi Aglili Omer, Chalbo lo ne'amar ela chalbam, Damo lo ne'amar ela damam. Okay, this is the pasuk. Ach B'chor shor, B'chor kesav, B'chor is lo tiftek kodashim. Et damam tizok. So it's talking about B'chor. It says their bloods you should pour on the altar. Et chalbam tachtir. Now, why does it say damam and chalbam and not damo v'chalbo? It's talking about singular, the B'chor. So according to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, right, so chabon le'onemar le'chabam, damo le'onemar le'damam, it's not singular, it's plural. Limeid al-B'chor u'maser u'pesach, shtunim matan damim v'imuim l'gabei mizbech. Now, maser and Pesach, we now learn, and we learned this on Lamed Zayin, it never says you have to burn the parts on the altar, it never says you have to put the blood on the altar. How do we know you have to do it? According to Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it comes from this pasuk, and that's why they're all the same when it comes to the matanot. It's matana achad, which, as I mentioned when we read the Mishna, they assume that means same method, zrika. However, you might remember, and I'll just refresh your memory, Rabbi Yishmael there says, no. Chalbam and damam relate to the B'chor. We don't learn. This pasuk isn't talking about Maser and Pesach. What's it talking about? It's just talking about B'chor. So, where do we learn Maser and Pesach from? How do we know you have to sprinkle the blood? And that's that pasuk. There was a general pasuk about your Zevachim. The blood should be yishpoch. Okay? So, I forgot exactly the words right now, but you can look back at Lamed Zayin. And that pasuk, it talks about shvicha, pouring, which is not throwing. Okay, it's a different method. So our Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yishmael because it says matanacha, which they assume means zrika and not pouring. Okay, last line for today. Keneged hayesod menalan amar Rabbi Elazar ata zrika me'ola. How do you know it has to be keneged hayesod? Because it says zrika here and it says zrika by the korban ola. And since the korban ola we already learned has to be on the corner where there's a yesod, also this one has to be on the corner where there's a yesod. Tomorrow we'll say, where do we get ola from, even though we know this already, and we'll go back to there. So what did we do today? Very simply, we'll review. We started with the statement about the borders of the Azara. It must have been coming to exclude something. It's coming to exclude those chambers. And then they said, well, not for eating. So, eating is a unique exception, but yes for tumah and yes for slaughtering. Even though one source says they are a kodesh, that was on a rabbinic level, but on a Torah level, no. And we had a whole back and forth about that, but that's our conclusion. Then we brought difficulty on the achila. We resolved that one. And then, don't you need petach or oil? And then they say, no, you don't. Then we had, how do we know the dam is disqualified on the day you do the slaughtering at sunset? We proved that from a pasuk. Then we had this machloket Rabbi Yochanan and Chizkiah about the night of the 3rd night. Is it, right, if you have a pigo machshava, if you eat it, is it really all usher or not? And, does it become pigo or not? We had 2 approaches because it's really in between. You don't yet burn it, but you can't eat it. So because of that, we had these 2 approaches. And then from there, we got to the Braita. They gave us the whole background as to how we know that there's this split where you can't eat it, but you also don't burn it yet. And how do and how we get that it's different from the ones that are eaten for 1 day. And then we ended with the Bechor, Maaser, and Pesach, and the differences and the similarities between them, and then pointed out that the Mishnah follows, specifically Rabbi Yossi Aglila's opinion. With there, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good week.